Please. The draw for the late date debate tonight has taken place, and it has been submitted by the MLA for Kings West. Therefore, be it resolved that the Nova Scotia government immediately address safety and road condition concerns related to the state of Route 4 in Richmond County and Cape Breton County. Daily routine, presenting and reading of petitions. The Honourable, the member for Cape Breton Nova, on an introduction first.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to bring the members' attention to the West Gallery today. In the West Gallery, we have Lena Garrison, who is here today and representing the Ecology Action Centre. So I'd like to have a warm welcome on behalf of the legislature. Mr.
The Honourable,
Speaker,
the member for Cape Breton Nova.
Thank you. I beg leave to introduce a petition on behalf of the Velo Cape Breton and the Ecology Action Centre. The operative clause being the Nova Scotia government, calling on the Nova Scotia government to allocate 10% of gas tax revenues to an active and sustainable transportation infrastructure. It contains 3,089 signatures, and I've affixed my signature in support, Mr. Speaker.
The petition is tabled. The Honourable, the member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to table a petition entitled "Our Democratic Rights Have Been Violated." Petition in support of O'Connell Drive residents to stop local improvement charges implemented by Councillor David Hensby without their knowledge.
The petition is tabled. Presenting reports of committees. Table reports, regulations, and other papers. Statements by ministers. The Honourable, the Minister of Human Resources.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to do an introduction before I start. I'd like to recognize in the East Gallery today Liz Chisholm, Chair of the Advisory Council on the Status of Women, Ann Kelly, a Council member, Bridget Newman, Executive Director for the Advisory Council on the Status of Women, Pamela Harrison, Transition House Association of Nova Scotia, Margaret Gulledge, a Deputy Commissioner of the Girl Guides of Canada, Margaret Galbraith, past Commissioner for the Girl Guides, Barbara Behringer, past Deputy Provincial Commissioner of Girl Guides, and these individuals joined me this morning for the statement in the House. And I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of them here today.
The Honourable, the Minister of Human Resources.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today, December 6th, the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women, with this message. Mr. Speaker, I hope that someday we will not need to bring this matter forward, and that there will be a day when women is free of domestic violence. On December 6, 1989, an angry young man carried a semi-automatic rifle into an engineering class at École Polytechnique in Montreal. He separated the women from the men and murdered 14 women. He had a hit list of an additional 19 women he identified as feminists, including the first female firefighter in Quebec, the first female police captain, the president of a trade union, a sport radio host, the immigration minister at the time, and a transition house worker. He was angry that women were achieving equality and were moving into positions that were once exclusively male. He blamed women for taking his place. He reacted with violence. Violence and the threat of violence have been used for thousands of years to control women's lives and maintain power. Women are being beaten, raped, and murdered in Nova Scotia and across Canada, as well as around the world, every single day. According to statistics from the Advisory Council on the Status of Women, 1 woman in 12 faces violence from an intimate partner, boyfriend, or husband, and 2/3 of the incidents of spousal violence are never reported to police. Women in Nova Scotia are about 40 times more likely to be killed by a spouse or intimate partner than they are by a stranger. Aboriginal women experience 4 times the violence as non-Aboriginal women and are at least 3 times more likely to have experienced spousal violence than non-Aboriginal women. About 88% of sexual assaults in Canada do not get reported to the police. In more than 3/4 of the cases reported to Halifax Regional Police in 2005, victims of sexual offenses knew the accused. In 2005, only 26% of reported sexual assaults in Nova Scotia resulted in the laying of a charge against the accused, down from 56% in 1993. According to data collected through the Nova Scotia Senior Abuse toll-free line, 2/3 of the calls identify women as the subject of senior abuse. We all have a role to play in stopping violence against women. Today and every day, we need to reflect on what we can do as individuals and as society to create a world where equality, fairness, and dignity prevail. Every hour of every day, a woman is intimidated, harassed, stalked, assaulted, or abused. Sometimes the violence leaves physical wounds. It always leaves emotional scars. For help, a woman might call a police department, a transition house, a women's resource center, sexual assault services, or victim services in order to rebuild her life and possibly the lives of her children. Mr. Speaker, it is important to reflect on how violence affects women and what we're doing about it throughout the year. The 16 days of activism to eliminate violence against women from November 25th to December 10th, and the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women on December 6th, heighten our awareness about the issue. The Nova Scotia Advisory Council on the Status of Women hosted an event at Province House this morning to mark December 6th. The focus on what families and friends can do to help women in abusive relationships. The Transition House Association of Nova Scotia and the local units of the Girl Guides of Canada participated. The Transition House Association of Nova Scotia displayed the Clothesline Project, a moving installation of dozens of purple scarves decorated by women who have survived violence. Mr. Speaker, we all have a role to play in stopping violence against women. During the last couple of weeks, my colleagues here and staff throughout government have worn purple ribbons in support of transition houses across this province. Many of you also have made a donation to a transition house, women's center, or sexual assault service near you. Personal safety and freedom from violence are a main goal of the Advisory Council. Council members and staff work with government departments, women's groups, and community agencies, anti-violence organizations, and other provincial and territorial status of women organizations to reduce violence against women. The Advisory Council is working with Mi'kmaq organizations and the provincial departments of Health, Justice, and Aboriginal Affairs. The goal is to research family violence in Mi'kmaq communities and to identify culturally appropriate ways to address the issues. Women in Nova Scotia will be safer when we can respond more effectively in a more coordinated way to the problem of sexual assault. This year, the Advisory Council helped fund a needs assessment of sexual assault services across this province to study how victims are helped in communities where no specialized services exist. The results will be released early in 2008. Nova Scotia Domestic Violence Intervention Act provides emergency protection. Domestic violence educators train police and other justice personnel on how to help families. Agencies in justice and in the community are working to provide better services in cases of high-risk domestic violence. Families and friends are often the first point of help for women in abusive relationships. That's why the Advisory Council revised its publication, Making Changes, to include advice and information for families and friends on the signs of abuse, ways to offer support, and a list of do's and don'ts. Violence against women in society seriously affects the ability of women to achieve equality. It is not only the incidence of violence that limits women's lives, but the fear of violence that affects our daily existence, how we dress, where we go, with whom we associate, and our mode of transportation. 14 years ago, on December 6, 1989, 14 women were murdered at École Polytechnique in Montreal. They were murdered because they were women. Whatever its form, violence against women is unacceptable. We all have a role to play in stopping violence against women, Mr. Speaker, and to stop it, we have to all work together.
The Honourable, the member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I haven't seen a copy of the ministerial statement, but this is an issue that's very important to me, and I would like to take this opportunity to respond. First of all, I echo the minister's sentiments and comments. I also want to, on behalf of our caucus, thank the community-based organizations and government agencies that are working on these issues. And I particularly want to mention the Transition House Association of Nova Scotia, the Women's Centres, Sexual Assault Centres, and Men's Intervention Programs. They're doing incredible work under very trying circumstances with increasing workload and very limited resources. And we certainly owe them a huge debt of gratitude. It's one thing to stand in this legislature, in this chamber, and honor the memory of women who have been abused or murdered. It's another thing to hear their voices directly, and it's another to document the risks. But I think each and every one of us, and certainly our three caucuses, have an even stronger responsibility to be proactive on this. We can't just look at women and children who find themselves in difficulty after suffering abuse and violence in their homes and on the streets. We have to actually develop a strategy to prevent women and children in Nova Scotia from falling into that situation. And there's so much that this government could be doing. We have to be looking at things like reducing poverty, like improving the early learning and childhood system, preserving the dignity and economic pensions and welfare of seniors. We need better training and education, especially for low-income women. We need to improve the mental health services, and on and on and on. So I challenge the government to be looking at proactive programs. Look at your legislation, look at your budgets, look at the current policies through a gender lens, because what we decide in this House has a different impact on women than it does on men. And I challenge all of us to keep that in mind and to take this issue very, very seriously. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Yeah. The Honourable, the member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise today to respond to the Minister's statement today, which is a very somber and special day for us to remember violence, to remember women and other victims of violence particularly, and to honor the women who lost their lives on December 6 in 1989. On behalf of my caucus, I can say very clearly this is a concern and an issue that we want to put on the front burner and not on the back burner in this province. And we have introduced a bill calling for a domestic violence court, which was introduced in this session. And I will be reintroducing the bill calling for a committee to study the elimination of domestic violence in the province of Nova Scotia. And as others have said, this is something that needs to be addressed now. It is not a problem that is getting better in any way, shape, or form. It is continuing, and it is continuing to rise. In my opinion, the numbers are higher every year, and hardly a week goes by that we don't read in our newspapers about horrendous things happening here in our own province, in big and small communities, in families where there is wealth, in families where there is poverty. Family violence exists in our communities and our neighborhoods, and we need to come up with the best strategies possible to address it, whether it be through education, whether it be through studying other jurisdictions to see how they've made an impact or a dent in this horrendous amount of violence and suffering that exists in our province. And we really have turned a blind eye. In the 5 years that I've been a member of the legislature, we haven't been discussing this, only very rarely. And I would call on the government to make this a priority. It's a simple thing to begin action to study a problem and to deal with it. I'm very pleased to see that there's research being done for the Mi'kmaq community, and that should be done, and as well as looking at the needs assessments around sexual assault services around the province. But we need to coordinate it. Those are two pieces of it. But the problem is much broader, Mr. Speaker, and I would call on the government to look at putting together a strategy that would help us eliminate or decrease the incidence of domestic violence in this province. It's very important for us, and particularly on such a somber day, that we start to look at funding for the services that we know work and making it evidence-based. There are some things that we may be funding that don't work. Let's look at what works and what works in other jurisdictions, and let's put a real push on behalf of all three caucuses in the legislature to say that this is a priority in our province and it's time for action. In the 1990s, we had a family violence prevention initiative that was underway, and that was cancelled in the early part of Dr. Ham's term as Premier. And I think we could, reinvigorate that or create a new strategy which is multi-departmental, including all the stakeholders who work in the frontline services, such as sexual assault services, the transition houses, the men's intervention, and the women's centers. Women and men that are working in the frontline services and know this problem better than any of us here in the legislature, and perhaps know some of the things that we need to be doing. But funding is essential, Mr. Speaker. Without it, we can't offer the services in all of our communities. We can't offer the breadth of services that are needed. And again, even with the agencies and groups I've mentioned, there's very little money for outreach. Many of you represent areas that have large urban components to them. People who live in those small towns and perhaps more isolated communities do not have access to services, and they need them too. And I think all of us need to look at the areas we represent and consider whether or not we believe that the services are available. Even here in HRM, for such a large area, we have only one home for women to turn to in transition, and it may not be close for the whole breadth of HRM as well. So we need to look even within the urban areas to see whether the extent of services is sufficient. Mr. Speaker, it is known as the 16 days of activism to fight domestic violence and violence against women, and I think it's a time when we need to examine what we're doing right here in our province and not just talk about domestic violence, but start to put some real resources and some commitment behind fighting it. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Government notices of motion. The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 90 years ago the Halifax explosion destroyed the very core of our capital region and shocked the world because of the extent of the devastation and losses suffered. Whereas amazingly, though, the magnitude of the situation never overwhelmed the people of this great province who battled fires, a blizzard, and personal loss to an extent we will never fully understand, and left as a legacy stories of incredible heroism and compassion that still make us proud today. And whereas emergency and health personnel and individuals risked or even lost their lives working to save others, like Vince Coleman, whose final act of dispatching a message to an approaching train meant the loss of his life for the sake of so many others. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House honor those lost that fateful day with a moment of silence and salute the many heroes who showed courage, ingenuity, a phenomenal survival instinct, and generosity, and thank the survivors who continue to share their stories, keeping this important part of our history alive for future generations. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Please stand for a moment's silence. Thank you. The Honourable the Premier.
Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the grade 6 classes of Bev White and Fran Schramm at Sir Charles Tupper Elementary have spent months researching and compiling information for their book on the Halifax explosion. And whereas these students and their teachers explored historical sites of the explosion, researched information at the Nova Scotia Archives, and spent time speaking to historians about this devastating event. And whereas thanks to the leadership of Bev White in applying for a grant to help with their project and Fusion Printing for publishing the book, the students will have, as a result of their efforts, an important account to share with others. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House, on this, the 90th anniversary of the Halifax explosion, thank the grade 6 teachers and their students for including in their studies such an important topic of our history, researching and understanding how it impacted the people, their resilience, and the subsequent rebuilding of our capital region. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Health Promotion and Protection on an introduction.
Mr. Speaker, if I may, I'd like to do an introduction. Today, visiting us in the East Gallery is the General Manager of the Halifax Regional Water Commission, Carl Yates, and along with Carl is Debbie Leonard, who is the Customer Service Manager. Carl and Debbie are here to watch the proceedings of the House, as a little later today we will see the introduction of a bill to assist the Halifax Regional Water Commission. I'd ask them to rise and receive the warm welcome of the members of the House.
There has been a request to revert back to the order of business, to tabling of petitions. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. The Honourable the Leader of the Official Opposition.
If I may, Mr. Speaker, thank you. If I may, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to make a couple of introductions before I table these petitions. In the East Gallery, we're joined today by Mr. Jim Connors, who would be known to many, if not all, members of this House, and with him is Madeline Bolivar and Denise Hockley, and they are here today to raise awareness with respect to the funding of the drug Avastin, and I'm going to be pleased to table a petition shortly in relation to that, but I'd ask the host to welcome them here today. I'll do this in two parts, Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to table a petition, the operative clause, which reads, we, the undersigned, want the Nova Scotia Department of Health to give all Nova Scotians living with cancer the best chance for survival by approving the funding of the cancer drug Avastin. There are 3,679 signatures on this petition from the Bridgewater, LaHave, Cockerell Banks, Dayspring area, Mr. Speaker, and I have been pleased to fix my signature.
The petition is tabled.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to table a petition. This is an online petition. The operative clause, which reads, we, the undersigned, want the Nova Scotia Department of Health to give to all Nova Scotia living with cancer the best chance for survival by approving the funding of the cancer drug Avastin. There are more than 3,300 signatures collected from around the province, Mr. Speaker, and I have been pleased to affix my signature.
The petition is tabled. The Honourable the Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. On a future day, I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the government's Buy Local campaign, Select Nova Scotia, was announced July 5th of this year, and whereas to help promote awareness, increase consumer knowledge, and encourage consumption of Nova Scotia agri-food products, a Minister's Advisory Committee on Buy Local was created to review Buy Local efforts and coordinate initiatives across the province. And whereas this advisory committee volunteered many of their spare time to work on promotional efforts and heighten the importance we place on getting locally produced food to Nova Scotia's consumers, therefore be it resolved that all members of the House congratulate and thank the members of the Minister's Advisory Committee on Buy Local. Most of them are seated in your gallery, Mr. Speaker, including Mr. Peter Swetnam, Chair of the Committee and President of the Chicken Producers of Nova Scotia and the Federation of Agriculture's representative. I do want to thank Peter for all his efforts. As well, Representative Wayne Atwater, a councillor with Kings County Municipality. Jeannie Cruikshanks, who isn't with us, Mr. Speaker, is the Vice President of Atlantic Canadian Council of Grocery Distributors. Laurie Jennings. Laurie's with the Canadian Federation of Independent Grocers. I certainly want to thank Laurie. And the president, and it wouldn't have been possible without the Women's Institute of Nova Scotia, and we have two members of the Women's Institute of Nova Scotia with us here today, and this very hard-working volunteer organization is represented today by their president, Ellen Simpson, and Sharon Link. And I do want to, I would like the House to welcome those two people. And we have with us the Executive Director of the Restaurant Association of Nova Scotia, Gordon Stort. And Gordon, we really appreciated Gordon's participation in the Advisory Council, and as well from the Department of Agriculture, Natalie Webster. Natalie's the Communication Director with the Department, and I would ask all members to give this hard-working group of volunteers a hearty round of applause, and I seek waiver of notice, Mr. Speaker.
There has been a request for waiver. There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Counterminded? Motion is carried. Just before I recognize the Minister for Military Relations, referencing back to the tabling of the petitions, the first petition that was tabled will be according to the rules of the host. The second petition, online petitions, are not recognized by the rules of the host, so therefore cannot be tabled. The Honourable the Minister of Military Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before I do my resolution, may I make an introduction?
Please do.
Mr. Speaker, in your gallery today, we're joined by a number of guests. They're here for a brief service that will be held down in the Veterans Room in a few moments. Mr. Speaker, in your gallery, we have the Honorary Naval Captain Myra Freeman. Apparently, Mr. Speaker, everybody knows the captain. Navy Captain Bill Woodburn, Commanding Officer of the Canadian Forces Base, Halifax. Colonel Clyde Russell, Chief of Staff of the Joint Task Force Atlantic. Mr. Joe Ramia, I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong, co-chair of the Festival of Trees. Mr. Brian Rankin, the other co-chair of the Festival of Trees. Mr. Rob Hunt, chair of the Board of Directors of the Mental Health Foundation of Nova Scotia. And Mr. Speaker, I see we have some guests also from the Royal Legion, Nunavut Command. I welcome them to the gallery today. I would also like to acknowledge the proud members of the Canadian Forces from the Joint Task Force Atlantic, many of who have served in Afghanistan, Mr. Speaker. Maybe they would stand. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Mr. Joe Ramia, owner of the Gallery 1 Furniture, commissioned local artist Holly Carr to design Festival Angel Christmas tree ornaments to commemorate the work of the Canadian Forces, particularly those who are deployed to Afghanistan. And whereas these ornaments adore the special Christmas tree that was auctioned, with the proceeds from the sale going to the Mental Health Foundation of Nova Scotia. And whereas the winning bid was made by Mr. Blaise Morrison, General Manager of the Halifax Shopping Centre, who in turn gave the tree back to the Canadian Forces so that it could be displayed in the Veterans Room of Province House. Therefore, it be resolved that all members of the House acknowledge the generosity and the community spirit of Mr. Joe Ramia and Mr. Blaise Morrison. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Community Services.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Kids Help Phone has been on the line for almost 20 years, and whereas Kids Help Phone is Canada's only toll-free, 24-hour, bilingual and anonymous phone counselling, referral and information service for children and youth, and whereas the Nova Scotia Government and Kids Help Phone have established a new partnership through our Child and Youth Strategy to ensure Nova Scotia's youth get relevant, targeted information to meet their needs. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House applaud the work of Kids Help Phone and encourage this partnership in particular and the Child and Youth Strategy in general, as we promise to continue focusing our energies and to change how we work within government and with others to make lives better for our most vulnerable Nova Scotians, our children. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver of notice. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Against? Motion carried. The Honourable the Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas during the Christmas season, when families throughout Nova Scotia traditionally celebrate their holidays with members of their families, there are several thousand members of the Canadian Forces who are deployed throughout the world in places such as Afghanistan and the Persian Gulf. And whereas, in addition to these international activities, our military personnel have willingly and enthusiastically provided their efforts to domestic operations and emergencies such as Swiss Air 111 in 1998 and Hurricane Juan in 2003. And whereas in recent memory, 14 Nova Scotia military personnel have made the ultimate sacrifice, including 10 soldiers in Afghanistan, 3 military search and rescue technicians from Greenwood, and a naval officer on Her Majesty's Canadian ship Chicoutimi. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House acknowledge the work and the sacrifices of the members of the Canadian Forces in their service of our nation and in our province, particularly at this time of the year, which traditionally is spent with their families. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver.
Thank you. Request for waiver has been requested. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Against? Motion carried. Introduction of bills. The Honourable the Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in my capacity as the Acting Minister responsible for the Elections Act. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 140 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Elections Act.
Thank you. The Honourable Minister begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 140 of the Revised Statutes of 1989, the Elections Act.
Bill 79, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 140 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Elections Act.
Order that this bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 120 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Daycare Act.
The Honourable Member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 120 of the Revised Statutes of 1989, the Daycare Act.
Bill 80, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 120 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Daycare Act.
Order that this bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act Respecting the Establishment of a Domestic Violence Prevention Committee in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act Respecting the Establishment of a Domestic Violence Prevention Committee in Nova Scotia.
Bill 81, entitled An Act Respecting the Establishment of a Domestic Violence Prevention Committee in Nova Scotia.
Order that this bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable the Minister of Environment and Labour. More bills. The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre. Bills. We're introducing bills. Okay. The Honourable Member for Halifax Atlantic.
I rise to introduce today, beg your leave to introduce today, an act entitled An Act to Recognize the Central Role of the Arts in Nova Scotia by Re-establishing an Arm's Length Arts Council.
The Honourable Member begs leave to table a bill entitled An Act to Recognize the Central Role of the Arts in Nova Scotia by Re-establishing an Arm's Length Arts Council.
Bill 82, entitled An Act to Recognize the Central Role of the Arts in Nova Scotia by Re-establishing an Arm's Length Arts Council.
Order that this bill be read a second time on a future day. The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act Respecting the Halifax Regional Water Commission.
The Honourable Member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act Respecting the Halifax Regional Water Commission.
Bill 83, entitled An Act Respecting the Halifax Regional Water Commission.
Or that this bill be read a second time on a future day. Notice of motion. The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 90 years ago today, on the morning of December 6, 1917, the relief ship Emo and the munition ship Mont Blanc collided in the narrows of Halifax Harbour, and whereas the munitions on the Mont Blanc exploded at 9:04 a.m. in the largest man-made blast prior to the nuclear age, and whereas the Halifax explosion killed 2,000 women, men, and children and left 9,000 more injured or disabled and destroyed large areas of Halifax and Dartmouth, therefore be it resolved that the House of Assembly, on the 90th anniversary of the Halifax explosion, remember this devastating event in our history and pay tribute to the first responders of 1917 who risked or sacrificed their lives to help others on that horrible morning, and to today's first responders who stand ready to step forward again in the event of any disaster. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Thank you. There's been a request for waiver of notice. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Against? Motion carried. The honourable member for Kings West.
Mr. Speaker, if I could revert back to the order of business on bills.
There's been a request to revert to the order of business introduction of bills. Is it agreed? Agreed. The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 13 of the Acts of 2002, the Volunteer Fire Services Act, on behalf of my colleague, the member from Clare.
Thank you. The honourable member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 13 of the Acts of 2002, the Volunteer Fire Services Act. Good speaker.
Bill 84, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 13 of the Acts of 2002, the Volunteer Fire Services Act.
Order that this bill be read a second time on a future day. The honourable member for Kings West.
Double jeopardy here. I'd like to, Mr. Speaker, I would like to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 31 of the Acts of 1996, the Sales Tax Act, on behalf of my colleague, the member of Clare.
A real good speaker. Thank you. The honourable member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 31 of the Acts of 1996, the Sales Tax Act.
Bill 85, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 31 of the Acts of 1996, the Sales Tax Act.
Order that this bill be read a second time on a future day. For more bills? The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Require the Payment of a Royalty on the Bottling of Water.
The honourable member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Require the Payment of a Royalty on the Bottling of Water.
Bill 86, entitled An Act to Require the Payment of a Royalty on the Bottling of Water.
Order that this bill be read a second time on a future day. We'll now return to the tabling notices of motion. The Honourable, the official Opposition House Leader. Leader.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas soccer is one of the fastest growing team sports in Canada, and whereas Cole Harbour Soccer Club prides itself on providing an opportunity for youths to build self-esteem, develop and enhance social skills, and to understand the importance of sportsmanship in a team atmosphere. And whereas the Cole Harbour Boys Under-14 Tier 2A soccer team won the championship of the Capital Inter-District Soccer League for 2007, and the gold medals for placing first in the Halifax Dunbrack and Pictou County United tournaments this past summer, therefore be it resolved that this House of Assembly commend the entire Cole Harbour Boys Under-14 B2A soccer team for their exemplary play, and that we extend our congratulations to all players, coaches, and parents for a strong team performance on winning the championship and the gold medal in 2007. And Mr. Speaker, I would request waiver and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver of notice. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Against? Motion carried. Notice of motion. The Honourable, the member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Clinton Thomas began working at the Nova Scotia Home for Coloured Children in 1977, and where he has been employed as a child care worker. Whereas Clinton Thomas is one of the few remaining employees who worked at the original old home site. Whereas Clinton Thomas is an excellent role model for the youth, and many former residents have come back to thank him for his dedication and belief in them. Therefore, it be resolved the members of this House of Assembly recognize Clinton Thomas for the hard work and dedication to the Nova Scotia Home for Coloured Children for the past 30 years. Encourage him to continue working with troubled youth for a better tomorrow. And Mr. Speaker, I'd ask for waiver.
Thank you. There's been a request for waiver of notice. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Against? Motion carried. The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Permission for an introduction?
Please do.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to introduce a couple of people in the East Gallery this morning. A former school friend of mine who I had the opportunity to play hockey, rugby, and softball with, international marathon runner. I'd like to introduce Chief Warrant Officer retired Kenneth Doucette and his beautiful wife Denise. I ask them to rise and the Assembly give them a round of applause. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas legendary Trenton marathoner Kenneth H. Doucette was recently honored in Ottawa, and whereas last month the Chief Warrant Officer retired MMMCD with the Canadian Armed Forces, 58-year-old Doucette was inducted into the prestigious Canadian Forces Sports Hall of Fame in Ottawa for his running achievements. And whereas Mr. Doucette is deeply honored with his new place amongst only 85 other names inducted since 1971, with some years having no inductees, and where he will join two other retired Pictou County natives, Chief Warrant Officer Les Mason and Major George Harper. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House offer their enthusiastic congratulations to Chief Warrant Officer retired Kenneth H. Doucette on his prestigious installment into the Canadian Forces Sports Hall of Fame, demonstrating again the breadth of talent that our province has to offer Canada. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver of notice. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Against? Motion carried. The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day, I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Self-Help Connection started in 1987 as a resource centre to develop and aid support groups throughout Nova Scotia, and whereas self-help groups help Nova Scotians develop individual and collective control over their health through building knowledge, skills, and resources. And whereas Self-Help Connection has received national recognition as a, quote, mental health best practice program, end of quote, from the Federal, Provincial, and Territorial Advisory Network on Mental Health for Self-Help and Consumer Initiatives. Therefore, be it resolved that this Nova Scotia House of Assembly congratulate the board, staff, and volunteers of Self-Help Connection on their 20th anniversary and recognize their valuable work with over 500 support groups across our province. Mr. Speaker, requests waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver of notice. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Against? Motion carried. The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Shayna Wilkie, a grade 9 student at Thompson Junior High School in North Sydney, was attending the Historical Fair of Cape Breton, and whereas Brianna McLean, a grade 9 student at Bridgeport School, Glace Bay, was also in attendance at that fair, and when she overheard her teacher say that a girl was choking, Brianna quickly performed the Heimlich maneuver, which dislodged the obstruction. And whereas later, the girls met and Shayna was able to thank Brianna, her hero, in person, Brianna learned the Heimlich maneuver while taking swimming lessons in grade 4. Therefore, be it resolved, the members of the House of Assembly congratulate Brianna McLean for both her humility and quick thinking, which saved the life of another student. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver of notice. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Against? Motion carried. The honourable member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice set on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Windsor-based Honourable H.E. Kendall chapter of the IODE celebrated their 60th anniversary in October, and whereas IODE Canada is a women's charitable organization, with each chapter shaping their respective agendas to suit the individual community needs such as education, social services, and citizenship programs, with students and women of all ages, from all walks of life and educational backgrounds participating for fun, friendship, and community volunteerism. And whereas the Windsor chapter consists of women of all ages and from different backgrounds, with their mission being to improve the quality of life for those in need. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House commend and congratulate the Windsor-based Honourable H.E. Kendall chapter of the IODE for 60 years of friendship and fellowship while helping so many people in their time of need. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver of notice. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Against? Motion carried. The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Pictou County Chamber of Commerce held their 15th Annual Business Achievement Awards on November the 8th at the DeCoste Centre in Pictou to recognize leadership and innovation in the local economy. And whereas the Export Achievement Award went to the Lismore Sheep Farm Wool Shop and River John Needle Company owners John and Lillian Crawford, and the Alec M. Mackay Nonprofit Organization of the Year was awarded to Summer Street Industries, and the Barry McMillan Entrepreneur of the Year was awarded to Jim Fitt of Velsoft Courseware, Inc. And whereas the Employee of the Year was awarded to Elaine Bosse of the Pictou Lodge Resort, and Business of the Year, sponsored by PRDC, was awarded to Strike McKay Limited, and Business Person of the Year, sponsored by Michelin, was awarded to Howard Anderson, Chartered Accountant with CIBC Wood Gundy. Therefore, it be resolved, this House of Assembly congratulate the Pictou County Chamber of Commerce on hosting a successful 15th Annual Business Achievement Award ceremony and acknowledge those who were recognized for their outstanding achievements. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver of notice has been requested. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Against? Motion carried. The Honourable, the Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on the morning of December 6, 1917, is remembered each year in Nova Scotia and beyond as a day filled with destruction and loss, and whereas Nova Scotians set aside time each year to remember the Halifax explosion, the victims, their families and friends, as well as those who came to aid, and whereas December 6, 2007 marks the 90th anniversary of this fateful day, therefore be it resolved that the members of the Nova Scotia Legislature take time to remember the victims of the Halifax explosion and continue to educate our children about this tragedy and the displays of courage that followed. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver of notice has been requested. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Against? Motion carried. The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas a special plaque was unveiled this past spring at the St. Mark's Masonic Hall in Baddeck, and whereas the plaque recognizes St. Mark's Masonic Hall as a municipal heritage property, and whereas besides the recognition as a municipal heritage property, service jewels were presented to members of St. Mark's Masonic Lodge, with William Roberts, Kenneth Mackenzie, and Norman Bethune being honored for 50 years of service, Carl Ham and Robert Grant for 55 years, Alan Nicholson for 60 years, with a 70-year bar going to Gordon McCollum. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly commend the significant accomplishments of both the St. Mark's Masonic Lodge for being recognized as a municipal heritage property, and to the members honored for their faithful years of dedicated service. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver of notice. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Against? Motion carried. The honourable member for Halifax Citadel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas today, December 6th, commemorates the 18th anniversary of the deaths of 14 young women at the École Polytechnique in Montreal, who were killed for no other reason than the fact that they were women. And whereas December 6th is a day when governments, organizations, and individuals in Canada are urged to remember these women and to take steps to deal with the root causes of this violence. And whereas women's centres across the province, including the St. Mary's University and Dalhousie University Women's Centres, have been in the forefront of the struggle against patriarchy, misogyny, and violence against women, therefore be it resolved that members of this House recognize the contributions of women's centres and shelters that are working to address and change these conditions of violence and injustice, and resolve to enact meaningful measures to make our communities safe for women and girls everywhere. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
A request for waiver of notice has been requested. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Against? Motion carried. The honourable member for Digby Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the importance of fish in the Maritimes is diverse, as it not only provides thousands of jobs on both coasts, but is also essential to living a long and healthy life. Whereas fish is rich in omega-3 fatty acids, which are essential for a healthy heart, optimal brain growth and development. And whereas numerous studies prove the fish-based omega-3s also play a role in decreasing cholesterol, lowering blood pressure, reducing risk of heart disease, stroke, Alzheimer's, and certain cancers. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the House encourage the education of Nova Scotians on the benefits of incorporating fish into our diet for the good health of all of our people. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request of waiver of notice. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Against? Motion carried. The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very proud to rise today on this resolution, which I hereby give notice on a future day. Mr. Speaker, I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Len and Pauline Goucher were married on this date, December the 6th, 1941, during the dark days of the Second World War. And whereas Len, a captain in the Halifax Rifles, left his new bride for the war-torn Europe, not returning to Canada until late December 1945. And whereas their lives together as parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents have stood the test of time, be it therefore resolved on the occasion of their 66th wedding anniversary, the members of this House pass on their sincere congratulations and best wishes on this day. Mr. Speaker, I would ask for a waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver of notice. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Against? Motion carried. The honourable member for Halifax Atlantic.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on Tuesday, May the 1st, 07, many talented youth from the Spryfield area presented their work, the Here We Are radio project. Spryfield youth tell their stories to the public at the Captain William Spry Library. And whereas these youth from both junior high and high school have worked diligently with library staff through weekly workshops in skills development, conducting interviews, creating their own audio pieces, editing and production. And whereas the project began airing on CKDU FM in May, and was partly facilitated by industry professionals with an interest in helping develop these skills among local youth, therefore be it resolved that this House of Assembly congratulate the Spryfield youth who took part in the Here We Are radio project, as well as recognizing the generous support of sponsors and partners, including the United Way, Action for Neighbourhood Change, HRM Community Development, Kim Cairns, King's School of Journalism, CKDU Radio, Mark Palermo, families and friends of the participants. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request of waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Against? Motion carried. The honourable member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Ellen Page, a young actress from Halifax, is taking the acting world by storm and is considered to be one of the up-and-coming actresses on the international stage. Whereas Ellen has already established herself as a serious young actress, determined to provoke audiences in some of the darkest roles in independent films of the past few years. And whereas on November 27th, Ellen was honoured as Breakthrough Actor at the 17th Annual Gotham Awards for her work on the critically acclaimed film Juno, a film which has already received top prize at the Rome Film Festival. Therefore be it resolved that all members of the House of Assembly congratulate Ellen Page on her outstanding accomplishments and wish her many successes in her acting career. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver of notice. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Against? Motion carried. The honourable member for Queens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the very successful 50th anniversary reunion of the Liverpool Regional High School was held in July of this year, and whereas 3 schools in the region of Queens, South Queens Junior High School, Dr. John C. Wickwire Academy, and Liverpool Regional High School have benefited financially from this reunion. And whereas these schools played an important role in the success of the reunion, with attendance surpassing expectations and thus generating this additional revenue. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly recognize the 50th Anniversary Reunion Planning Committee Chair, David Potty, and his committee members on this very successful reunion and their financial support of the South Queens Junior High, Dr. John C. Wickwire Academy, and Liverpool Regional High Schools in the constituency of Queens. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver of notice. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Against? Motion carried. The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Glace Bay Miners Bantam female hockey team participated in the Nova Scotia Bantam Tier 1 Provincial Championship recently in Pictou, coming away with a 2-2 record. And whereas the team, coached by Andre Arsenault, Carly Robson, and Curtis Billard, was awarded the Fair Play banner, and whereas Miranda Tuddy was named top defence for the tournament and Rebecca McDonald was a tournament all-star. Therefore, be it resolved, the members of the House of Assembly congratulate the coaches and members of the Glace Bay Miners Bantam female hockey team and wish them well in their future endeavours. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Thank you. There's been a request for waiver of notice. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Against? Motion carried. The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas healthcare professionals deserve our thanks and profound respect, and whereas the staff in the nutritional counselling services at the Sacred Heart Hospital in Shettycamp help residents of the area eat healthier and manage conditions requiring special diets, and whereas these staff work hard to educate, assist people in understanding that healthy eating and good health are strongly linked, therefore be it resolved that all members of the legislature extend our thanks to the staff of the nutritional counselling services at Sacred Heart Hospital in Shettycamp and thank all healthcare professionals in our province for their commitment to delivering health care in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I request a waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There's been a request for waiver of notice. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour of the motion, please say aye. Against? Motion carried. The honourable member for Timberley Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas legendary soccer coach Jim Slongwhite is the head coach of both Halifax County youth soccer teams that qualified for the Canadian Championships. Whereas at the Nationals in October, Coach Slongwhite began his week with the under-16 boys in Sherwood Park, Alberta, before finishing the week with the under-14 girls team in St. John's, Newfoundland, Labrador. And whereas the sport of soccer continues to grow in popularity in our community because of the dedication of coaches like Jim Slongwhite, therefore be it resolved that this House of Assembly congratulate and thank Jim Slongwhite for his exemplary commitment to promoting youth soccer in the province of Nova Scotia. I ask for a waiver and passage without debate, Mr. Speaker.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Cape Breton South.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas for 25 years, Alice Housing has been a place of refuge for women and children experiencing domestic violence, providing a safe environment and quality programs to the families under their care. And whereas the Excellence in Provision of Basic Necessities Award is given by the Donner Foundation to recognize excellence in social service provision by Canadian nonprofit organizations by encouraging best practices and greater accountability. And whereas this is the second time in 3 years that Alice Housing has won the Excellence in Provision of Basic Necessities Award. Therefore, be it resolved, the members of the House of Assembly recognize the efforts of Alice Housing and thank them for helping to make victims of domestic abuse feel safe and cared for. And I was asked for a waiver, Mr. Speaker.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I'd like to introduce a resident of Eastern Passage and a neighbour of mine in the West Gallery, and more importantly, certainly on today's proceedings, a valued healthcare professional and returning resident coming back on a regular basis since we've opened the House to share the proceedings that we're doing here. It's Shauna Kearley, and I'd ask that the House offer her a warm welcome.
The Honourable, the member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage with her resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Albert Horn, a member of the Royal Order of Antediluvian Buffaloes in Eastern Passage, will be celebrating a milestone on December 7th, his 100th birthday, and whereas Albert Horn is thought to be a descendant of one of the most noteworthy early settlers of Eastern Passage, Jacob Horn, who was a prominent landowner and having once the land rights to McNabb's Island, Devil's Island, and much of what is now known to be Quigley's Corner. And whereas family and friends will join together this coming weekend to celebrate Albert's birthday in his community of Eastern Passage, therefore be it resolved that this House of Assembly extend congratulations and best wishes to Albert Horn of Eastern Passage on the occasion of his 100th birthday on December 7th, 2007. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Donnie Taylor began volunteering with the Aylesford Volunteer Fire Department in 1947, and whereas on May 5, 2007, Mr. Taylor was recognized by the Aylesford Volunteer Fire Department as he retired after 60 years of service. And whereas Donnie Taylor has served the community of Aylesford well, setting an example for all who have worked with him and displaying his passion for firefighting and developing a strong department. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this House recognize the contribution Donnie Taylor has made to his community and thank him for his 60 years of volunteering as a firefighter. Mr. Speaker, I ask for a waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Waverley Fall River Beaverbank.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the West Gallery, I'd like to make a brief introduction, if I may. In the West Gallery, and I would ask them to rise, we've got a maybe small in quantity, but certainly good quality from the riding of Waverley Fall River Beaverbank, and most notably downtown Waverley. And if the House would please give them a warm welcome, it would be appreciated.
The Honourable, the member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on October 23, 2006, I wrote the Speaker of the House asking that he bring the issue of online petitions to the attention of the Committee on Assembly Matters so that our legislature could modernize our practices. And whereas online petitions are in common use in Nova Scotia, and this summer the Premier himself called on citizens to sign an online petition in support of the original Atlantic Accord. And whereas today an online petition was presented here in the legislature and has been rejected because our rules have not kept pace with technological changes. Therefore, be it resolved that MLAs in this House recognize the pressing need to accept online petitions and agree to refer this matter today to the Committee on Assembly Matters to draft the necessary rule changes. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The Honourable, the Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Premier and his Conservative government's new Nova Scotia includes a province where healthcare workers will not be given the right to strike, and whereas due to this Conservative government's lack of action, the healthcare system remains in shambles, and whereas it is unacceptable for the Conservatives to be playing politics with the careers and rights of thousands of healthcare workers in this province, therefore be it resolved that the Premier and his Conservative government cease their needless battle with Nova Scotia healthcare workers and focus on the real problems facing our healthcare system, such as doctor and nurse shortages, wait times, and ER closures. Mr. Speaker, just trying to set the mood. I ask for a waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. Okay. Orders of the day. Oral questions put by members. The time is 1:21. We'll go till 2:21. The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question this afternoon will be for the Premier. Yesterday, the Premier appeared to be announcing the end of health care as we know it. His State of the Province address said, and I quote, "We will establish protection standards and control that will allow publicly funded private facilities to play a clearly defined role in providing access to certain and prescribed health services." Clearly, the Premier must have consulted with someone before coming to this decision. He wouldn't have done it on his own. So my question for the Premier is this: will the Premier tell this House which for-profit companies and corporate promoters he has been dealing with on this strategy?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I find it difficult to understand why the Leader of the Opposition will be against ensuring that our public are protected, that the proper standards are put in place, Mr. Speaker, that the proper procedures are put in place to protect the public, Mr. Speaker. Now, the NDP is stuck, Mr. Speaker, many, many years ago. And the reality is that the system needs change, Mr. Speaker. The public are prepared for that change, Mr. Speaker, and we need to make sure that they are protected as we move forward.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, if the Premier had not abandoned the Canada Health Act and had instead consulted healthcare workers, he may have learned how to shorten wait times within budget. Dow Surgery recently outlined a plan called Keeping the Promise, a strategy for access, innovation, and accountability. I'll table a copy of this for the Premier if he'd like to read it. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Premier is this: why would his government try to auction off healthcare services at the very same time that doctors are ready with these innovative solutions to improve access and to cut wait times within the public system?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the leader of the opposition can spin all the political rhetoric he wants, Mr. Speaker. The reality, Mr. Speaker, is that this government stands by the Canada Health Act. Mr. Speaker, there will be no queue jumping, Mr. Speaker. The public health system that we have in our country and that we have in our province is one we are very proud of, Mr. Speaker. And we will ensure, Mr. Speaker, as we move forward, with the new realities of our healthcare system and the costs associated with that, we will make sure that the procedures and protocols are put in place to protect our public.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition, on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier is willing to sell out the healthcare system that defines Canada as a country for one reason only, for his search for something that he can gain from politically through divisive political tactics, Mr. Speaker. That's a fact. My question is this. When will this Premier admit that he has lost control of healthcare and that he is raising the idea of for-profit healthcare because of a crisis that his own government has created?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition said that we have the best health care system in Canada. Well, Mr. Speaker, again, spinning political rhetoric. Mr. Speaker, you know, we have to put Nova Scotia first, and we have to put Nova Scotians first, Mr. Speaker. The only people that are putting politics first are the NDP, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. We previously tabled documents from a group of desperate doctors who are looking for possible alternative delivery models for Nova Scotia. Today, we have another memo from this same group that I will table, which further explains their proposal for private health care delivery. In this memo, we see their recommendations that these private health care facilities, and I quote, should not be staffed by unionized personnel. We know that the Premier and his Health Minister were approached by this group of surgeons concerning their proposal, and he now intends to move forward with private health care. So my question is to the Premier, if you were following the recommendations of this concept document, do you plan to staff these private health care clinics with non-unionized health care workers?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, that's a purely hypothetical question, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the reality is, Mr. Speaker, is that we all have a responsibility to make sure that those procedures and standards and protocols are put in place to protect the public, Mr. Speaker, and protect the public system, Mr. Speaker, and the Canada Health Act that we all cherish. Mr. Speaker, this is not uncommon in other jurisdictions. There are similar procedures and protocols put in place in places like Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Quebec, Alberta. So, Mr. Speaker, we're not breaking new ground here. We were very clear in our throne speech. We indicated that we would be moving forward in this direction, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, I would hope that those on the other side of the House will support us in this endeavour.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Healthcare workers, like so many other sectors of this province and across the country, have fought long and hard for the rights and benefits that they now have thanks to unionization. Unionized healthcare workers are the backbone of our healthcare system. Now that you'd be able to tell by the stance that the Premier and his Conservative government have taken in trying to remove the right to strike from our healthcare workers. So my question to the Premier is, does the Premier support the idea of a non-unionized environment in healthcare?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, you know, again, we're hearing the spin of political rhetoric on the other side of the House. Mr. Speaker, we deal with such private organizations, such as EHS, actually set up by the then Liberal government in the 1990s, which is unionized, Mr. Speaker. And we respect those who are parts of unions in our province, and we will continue to work with them and to respect the very nature of what they do. Nursing homes is another example, Mr. Speaker. We deal with many private sector individuals in that regard. Small options homes. The list goes on, Mr. Speaker. You know, the spin and the political rhetoric of the other side, Mr. Speaker, and the fear-mongering, I'm sure we'll hear more about it in the coming months, Mr. Speaker, but the people of this province don't buy it.
Don't buy it.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Liberal Party on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's healthcare workers today. Who's next? The issue around labor issues in the province of Nova Scotia and healthcare is not the cause of the problem that Nova Scotians are telling all of us. They're talking about the shortage of doctors, talking about the shortage of nurses. They're talking about wait times. Mr. Speaker, picking a fight with our healthcare workers is not ensuring that Nova Scotians have access to the quality healthcare that they expect each and every one of us here to protect and deliver for them. So my question to the Premier, will the Premier abandon his campaign against unionized healthcare workers and get down to the real issues facing Nova Scotians when it comes to healthcare?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, when it comes to healthcare in this province, this Premier and this government will stand up for every single Nova Scotian, not just unions, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. This morning, Jim Connors, Madeleine Bolivar of Bridgewater, Denise Hockley of Sackville brought forward another 5,000 signatures from Nova Scotians petitioning this government to include Avastin on the provincial formulary of approved cancer drugs. Quebec, Mr. Speaker, has joined British Columbia and Newfoundland and Labrador in covering Avastin, and that means about 40% of Canada's population is covered, yet this government remains where it is. Mr. Speaker, when will this Premier reconsider the government's ill-advised role in preventing Nova Scotians from getting the health care they require?
The Honourable the Premier.
Speaker, I will refer that to the Minister of Health, who will once again describe the process that any potential drug in our province will go through.
The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we all know that through the Cancer Systemic Therapy Policy Committee, that they review these types of drugs on a semi-regular basis as they come along. Mr. Speaker, there are thousands of different drugs coming out by the hundreds of different drug companies on a regular basis that we need to have reviewed. Mr. Speaker, all of them have some kind of claim that it is a miracle drug and that it will save lives. And Mr. Speaker, quite honestly, as it moves around with Avastin is not all that it is set out to be. Mr. Speaker, we continue to work with the Cancer Systemic Therapy, which is made up of experts, which is made up of cancer oncologists, which is made up of regular Nova Scotians that have made a decision and said that the information that is provided to them does not help them in supporting this drug for coverage.
The Honourable the Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the weight of scientific research is growing against the position of the government in this regard. So, Mr. Speaker, if the Premier won't help with the cost of this life-saving drug for hard-working people like Michael Bolivar, then he should at least urge the Minister of Health to fast-track a provincial colorectal screening system. Nova Scotians recently learned that this government allowed state-of-the-art colorectal screening equipment to set idle while frustrated doctors struggle with screening wait times that they describe as infinite, Mr. Speaker. So my question is this: how can the Premier be so negligent when he lets needed medical equipment set idle, although many individuals and organizations, including Cancer Care Nova Scotia, are urging action?
Honourable the Premier.
Speaker, I refer that to the Minister of Health to update the House on the steps.
The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I know that the Department of Health has been working diligently in creating the colorectal screening program, working with its partners, of course, Cancer Care Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, what we need to make sure is that when we do have equipment, and the equipment that we do have has been referenced by the opposition, that we do have at the Cobequid Health Centre, Mr. Speaker, we don't have the people in order to operate that equipment. Mr. Speaker, we need to make sure that we have the physicians, we got to have the technologists, and we need to make sure that we have the safest possible outcomes for all patients in Nova Scotia. What they're saying is just to put something together and hope that it's going to work.
The Honourable the Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of government, they don't have the staff to operate the equipment. You've got to ask the question, whose fault is that? Mr. Speaker, whose fault is that?
Colorectal cancer is the third most frequently diagnosed cancer in Canada, the second most common cause of cancer-related death, and the incidence of this disease is high in Nova Scotia. Colorectal cancer can be prevented if it is caught in the early stages, yet this government takes a leisurely approach to screening, and it won't cover life-saving drugs prescribed for patients like those who are here today. So my question, Mr. Speaker, to the Premier is why has the Premier let his government squander so much time when each month of delay puts more Nova Scotians in greater and greater danger?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'll refer that to the Minister of Health.
The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Knowing the cancer situation in our province, we make sure that we continue to invest in that system. $48 million recently negotiated with the federal government to make sure that we have the best possible radiation oncology program in all of Canada. Mr. Speaker, we also want to make sure that we have the right kind of drugs available to Nova Scotians. And I want to table this document, and I know the member opposite would like to have a look at this, that the cancer therapies that have been reviewed and have been funded by the Cancer Systemic Therapy Committee. And they total to an extra $9.7 million worth of drug coverage for all Nova Scotians.
The Honourable the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, last week, 2,132 seniors were waiting for a nursing home bed. I will table that data, Mr. Speaker. This is far more than the government admitted in its public statements. There is a 50% increase in just 1 year. 2,132 seniors and their families have been assessed and approved for long-term care, but there is no place for them. The Premier offers them beds in the year 2010 at the earliest. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier tell those seniors, their families and caregivers, why his government sat on its hands and let the waiting list for long-term care increase so significantly?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member knows that the government is taking a number of steps through the continuing care strategy in dealing with our seniors. And some of those options are improving the programs to keep individuals at home, Mr. Speaker, because many individuals want that opportunity, Mr. Speaker. And we recognize that we have challenges with regards to the number of long-term care beds required for our senior citizens. That's why we have moved forward on a plan with over 800 beds, Mr. Speaker, as the first round. And you need to plan for that, obviously, Mr. Speaker, as we all would recognize. And we will move forward with our next phase. There has also been short-term measures. And, you know, my honourable colleagues makes it sound as if none of these individuals actually have a bed. And the reality of it, Mr. Speaker, is that our district health authorities and our hospitals are making sure, Mr. Speaker, that these individuals require the have the very best care possible in our facilities.
The Honourable the Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Well, you know, I'm glad the Premier mentioned that they're in hospital, so I'm going to give him an example of what happens to some of the people that are in hospital, Mr. Speaker. Ralph Bell has been one of those seniors. He spent 6 months in the Aberdeen hospital waiting for a nursing home bed, and upon discharge, he was billed $5,000 for his stay in hospital. Now, Mr. Speaker, his family managed to pay the hospital $2,000. They had to pay upfront for his nursing home bed. They were told that they should prepay his funeral. There's no money left to pay the rest of the hospital bed, the rest of the hospital bills. And Mr. Bell's daughter has been told that if they don't pay up, this file is going to collection, Mr. Speaker. So how can the Premier justify this treatment of seniors who are being forced to wait and wait in hospital because the Conservatives actually cut the number of nursing home beds in the first 8 years of their mandate?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'll refer that to the Minister of Health to give clear indication to the member what steps are being taken.
The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And maybe I thought this would be a good opportunity to talk about the continuing care strategy and give an update to the members opposite of exactly what's been going on. Mr. Speaker, I know over the last, in this fiscal year, that we are expanding the repair and adaptation programs through the Department of Community Services to make sure that those individuals can, of course, stay in their home the longest, at a cost of $4 million. Mr. Speaker, to expand the challenging behavior program, making sure that those seniors that of course, have more challenges are taken care of. That's $1 million. To evaluate the self-managed care program and continue to expand that. That's $1.7 million. To develop a restorative care program, $2.7 million. Mr. Speaker, I can go on and on and on of what this government is doing for the seniors of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition, on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, here we have a senior forced to wait in less than ideal conditions for 6 months, and now his family is being put through even more stress. Meanwhile, he has been waiting since April for a transfer to a nursing home near his family. And Mr. Speaker, there's no end in sight. So my question to the Premier is this. Ralph Bell and his family have done their share of waiting. Why can't the government show common sense and patience in dealing with them and the large hospital fee that they have been charged as a result of the policy of this government?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Speaker, I refer that to the Minister of Health.
The Honourable, the Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And if we remember a number of years ago, we changed the way that seniors are taken care of in our long-term care facilities and how the dollars are split up and who's responsible for what. And Nova Scotians and the government of Nova Scotia have picked up the charge for medical care of those individuals, and will continue to do that, Mr. Speaker. At the same time, the dollars on room and board, or the rental part of that, of course, is charged back to seniors. Mr. Speaker, I would suggest that hadn't we changed that, that the individual probably would have been covered through our system. And if I remember correctly, it was on the movement of the NDP for us to make that change.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. Our healthcare system is in crisis in this province. ERs have been closed for almost 6,000 hours so far this year. And despite what the Minister of Health might say, 98% is not good enough. Wait times are constantly growing for health services. Orthopedic surgery is at a 2-year wait. People are waiting over 8+ hours for an emergency room service, and tens of thousands of Nova Scotians are living without a family doctor. So my question to the Premier is, why are you picking a fight with healthcare workers at a time when there are so many real problems with our healthcare system?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, this government has made significant investment in the healthcare system in this province, Mr. Speaker, since 1999, and each and every year we add more money to that budget. Mr. Speaker, we have to find new ways of doing things moving forward in a modern-day healthcare system. We have to continue working with those working in the healthcare system, Mr. Speaker, our doctors, our nurses, our medical lab techs, and others, to find the very best processes in place for our patients. Because, Mr. Speaker, it's not about special interests. The only special interests there are people.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Liberal Party, on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's already a shortage of doctors, nurses, and other healthcare professionals in this province, and we haven't seen the worst of it yet. Nurses will be reaching retirement age in droves over the next 5 or so years, making a good faith collective bargaining process even more difficult by taking away healthcare workers' right to strike is not going to make Nova Scotia a more attractive option when trying to recruit healthcare workers to this province. So my question is to the Premier. When will the Premier give up his attack on healthcare workers and concentrate on recruiting efforts for all healthcare professionals?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, this government has more doctors per capita than any other province across the country, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this province, from the steps it has taken, Mr. Speaker, keeps over 80% of our nursing graduates here at home, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Liberal Party, Mr. Speaker, is simply spinning once again, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is this government is taking steps, making the necessary investments, and making a difference for the people's health care in this province.
The Honourable the Leader of the Liberal Party on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Talk about spinning. And the Premier knows when he quotes that issue around more doctors per capita than any other province, that the majority of those doctors that he's speaking about are not out there making sure that all Nova Scotians have access to a full-time doctor. Many of them are working in part-time practices, and you know that. Why would the people of Digby be looking for doctors? Why would the people in Clare be looking for doctors? Why would the very people in Inverness be still looking for doctors if we have such a surplus of family physicians in the province of Nova Scotia and a surplus of healthcare workers?
Question.
When will the Premier stand up and finally admit he's focusing on the wrong problem with healthcare and concentrate on the real facts and the issues that are facing Nova Scotians when it comes to healthcare?
The Honourable the Premier.
Speaker, I'll refer that to the Minister of Health to provide some clarity for my honourable colleague.
The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, the member opposite would have all people in Nova Scotia and all people in this House believe that we are alone in this physician shortage issue. Mr. Speaker, we know that even with the ratio that we do have, that we are short physicians across this province, and we'll continue to work with the...
Who's got the floor? Order, please. Order, please. The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thought he was finished asking his question, so I sat down again in his respect. Mr. Speaker, we have had a net growth of doctors in Nova Scotia. Even with our ratio, and our ratio is the best one in Canada, we still have requirements for doctors in Nova Scotia. We've had a net growth in doctors since January of last year. We've added 55 physicians, 31 in rural areas. We've had four CAP candidates begin practicing in rural communities in the next 60 days. Mr. Speaker, we will have a 24/7 ER in Digby as of January.
The Honourable the Member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Justice. Mr. Speaker, staff at the Central Nova Scotia Correctional Facility in Burnside are very concerned about occupational health and safety. Staffing levels are so low there, the staff feel unsafe. Increasingly, today's inmates are jailed for drugs, extreme violence, and gang-related crimes. The stress of dealing with overcrowded conditions is a growing concern to correctional officers, and this problem is spreading across the province, Mr. Speaker. So my question for the minister is this: how are you going to keep your correctional officers safe in overcrowded, stressful prisons?
The Honourable the Minister of Justice.
Much, Mr. Speaker, and the honourable member brings to light something that we are working in a very responsive way within the system with management plans around the allocations and the pressures that do exist within our correctional facilities in all 5 across the province. But of the 452 beds in Nova Scotia, we have a large number, 272, that would be in the Burnside facility between male and female inmate populations. Mr. Speaker, we have a management strategy in place that's working. We have measures to deal with those issues that happen because of intermittent sentences, and especially remand offenders on the weekend. So we have a plan in place. We continue to monitor that, and we will work effectively in the system with professionals we have that do a great job for Nova Scotians.
The Honourable the Member for Halifax Needham on her first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, the parking lot and surrounding area in Burnside is unsafe because there is no staffed gatehouse and no secure fence around the property. Staff have been assaulted in the car park by former inmates. A female staff member was followed home from there recently and assaulted when buying gas. Despite repeated requests, the necessary security upgrades have not been made, and the issue is the subject of an occupational health and safety complaint at this very moment, Mr. Speaker. So I would like to ask the minister, when will these upgrades be made to ensure your department's compliance with violence in the workplace regulations?
The Honourable the Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And again, we have protocols in place with regards to our correctional facilities. We also have plans in place to deal with the pressures around that, especially when you deal with Cumberland and Antigonish counties that currently have a 44-bed complement and planning in place to make sure that we have enough beds to take pressure off. And as the members would know, that inmates are moved around the province depending on the need and capacity that's there, and especially for overflow. We take that very seriously. Mr. Speaker, she referred to inaction. I would request that she provide the House with those statements that need to be followed up on it, and I'll review them.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham on her final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, officers working in correctional facilities in some Canadian provinces receive mandatory outside escort training. This is the situation in Manitoba and Ontario. Mandatory training, along with specialized equipment like Kevlar vests, go a long way to reduce stress relating to the threat of violence. But here in Nova Scotia, correctional officers don't get the same protection as deputy sheriffs. So, Mr. Speaker, will the minister tell us when he's going to ensure the same level of protection for correctional officers as his department provides for deputy sheriffs?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, as I would remind the member opposite, there are protocols in place, and they are followed. They're taken very seriously. There are contingency plans that are put in place by the department and through the correctional facilities. If there's something specific that she's raised, I've committed to review that, and I've committed to review that to the honourable member from Hants East. And Mr. Speaker, you know, again, there is a process with regards to bringing concerns forward, and we take them very seriously, and this government will act responsibly as we have in the past and will continue to do well into the future as this government continues its mandate for Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Justice. I will table an article dated November the 5th from the Chronicle Herald titled, quote, "Justice Slow for Women Abused by Partners," end of quote. In this article, Helen Morrison, who works with abused women, states, and I quote, "It's 8 months of looking over your shoulder, and it's 8 months spent wondering when you walk out or in your door if he's going to be there," end of quote. My question to the Minister of Justice: why are women and children leaving abusive situations forced to wait so long for court hearings?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and the honourable member, especially given the significance of today, as well as dealing with any domestic violence issues, and one that I take very seriously and recognize affects all communities across and all social strata across the province of Nova Scotia. And that's in part, Mr. Speaker, why we've been acting with our crime prevention strategy that we'll be rolling out next week for all Nova Scotians. That's why, Mr. Speaker, the Department of Community Services invested $5.7 million to make sure to fund transition houses and support for individuals, but not only the people that are victims, but also the abusers, to make sure that this is not repeated. And, Mr. Speaker, we will continue with those efforts, and she'll see in the coming days how serious we are in taking those and making sure true actions are occurring on a day-to-day basis.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Other provinces have instituted specialized domestic violence courts. In fact, Winnipeg's Family Violence Court, the first of its kind in Canada, received a United Nations Public Service Award in 2006. Ontario has domestic violence courts operating in 30 communities across the province, and New Brunswick became the first province in Atlantic Canada to enact a domestic violence court last year. My question to the Minister of Justice: when will Nova Scotia families benefit from a domestic violence court?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And to the honourable member, as she would know, in a number of instances, the government, through the throne speech, had committed with regards to the establishment of a mental health court. That is part of a whole specialty court process that we're dealing with. And, Mr. Speaker, as we often know, with all these situations, they're often intertwined and cross over. So we take that very seriously. We work with the judiciary, Mr. Speaker, and I commit to that member that ongoing efforts between justice and the judiciary are making and ensuring and working across the government departments through health, through community services, health promotion and protection. All of those are part of the integrated approach that's been announced, and we'll continue to roll that out in the coming days.
The Honourable, the member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley, on our final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're talking here about a particularly vulnerable portion of our population in Nova Scotia, and any delay in the judicial system processes actually puts these women and children at further risk. Mr. Speaker, these courts would provide timely access to court hearings and facilitate getting peace bonds. In the best models, every staff person who works in the court, from clerks to police, Crown attorneys to victim support workers, receives specialized training in family violence. My question to the Minister, will he commit to speaking with his counterparts in Ontario, Manitoba and New Brunswick with the aim of implementing a similar program in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable, the Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I can comment to my honourable colleague that that's in fact what we're doing. We've just recently had federal, provincial, territorial meetings across a whole segment, and one of the things as well that was part of that was funding for legal aid services and working with Canada to make sure across that spectrum. Mr. Speaker, we're making sure in terms of protecting Nova Scotians, the only province to actually step out ahead with 250 policing officer commitment over 4 years to make sure, Mr. Speaker, with our crime prevention strategy, it's just not about enforcement, it's about intervention and prevention. And again, I think the honourable member will be very pleased to see what we're doing, and I will take her up and make sure we do the follow-up.
The Honourable, the member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier, Mr. Speaker. Well, you know, Mr. Speaker, it took a while, but the Premier has finally shown his true colours. He's revealed to Nova Scotians that he wants a private health care system in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, in his throne speech, the Premier said his intention was to introduce public-private partnerships, and then earlier on this week he suggested he might be supportive of some form of private investment in health care. And lo and behold, yesterday the Premier said he wants private hospitals and he'll introduce the legislation or regulations this spring. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians understand that health care is expensive and they recognize that it consumes almost half of the provincial budget. But they also understand that many of their tax dollars go towards paying for health care. So my question for the Premier, Mr. Speaker, how can the Premier support any Nova Scotian paying twice for health care, once through their taxes and again for a private hospital?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member just doesn't get it, Mr. Speaker. Just doesn't get it, Mr. Speaker. I mean, this is the same caucus, Mr. Speaker, and the government before, which moved forward with the private sector on what is the best ambulance system in the world, Mr. Speaker. And I've heard members say that on the other side. And you know what? I agree with them, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable, the member for Glace Bay, on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I don't get it. I don't get it. I would suggest, Mr. Speaker,
Order, please. Order. The Honourable, the member for Glace Bay.
Premier, invest in a mirror and perhaps look at the real person who doesn't get it, Mr. Speaker. You know, Mr. Speaker, we know that private health care is accessible only to those who can afford it. Yet all Nova Scotians pay for health care. And as leaders in this province, Mr. Speaker, we have to ensure that no one is left behind. The most vulnerable Nova Scotians, those with the most need, are often those with the least resources. So my question for the Premier, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Premier, how do you think private health care will ensure adequate care for the most vulnerable in Nova Scotia, regardless of their ability to pay?
The Honourable, the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the member is putting forward a myth, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a myth, Mr. Speaker. I mean, we deal with the private sector on a daily basis, Mr. Speaker. Yes, we talked about public-private partnerships. I don't know if he's suggesting that that particular caucus is against working with the private sector. I would be surprised at that, Mr. Speaker. And that's what he's saying, Mr. Speaker. The fact is, we deal with our private sector ambulance system here in this province, Mr. Speaker. We deal with the private sector in our long-term care facilities, and we deal with the private sector in many other aspects of health care and beyond, Mr. Speaker. At the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, it's about the patient. And it's about ensuring the quality of service that they're getting and about making sure that they get that service as quickly as possible.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The only myth around here is the Premier's leadership, Mr. Speaker. Let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, the Premier believes that private health care is going to solve all the problems. It's only going to create one huge problem if this government does not ensure that equal access to health care is available regardless of the ability of anyone in this province to pay. Mr. Speaker, my final question to the Premier is, will the Premier admit that there are more important things to discuss concerning health care in this province, and finally give up his attack on health care workers in this province?
The Honourable the Premier.
Yes, there's myths and realities, and the reality is that we are sitting on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, and they are sitting on that side of the House, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are going to continue working with the professionals in our healthcare system to make sure that Nova Scotians have the very best health care possible. And, Mr. Speaker, if that means making change in our system, then we will make that change, Mr. Speaker, and we will work with them to ensure that that change is in their best interest.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Labour. Mr. Speaker, yesterday in the House, the Minister of Labour advised retail workers who don't want to work on Boxing Day or other uniform closing days to exercise the right to refuse the Labour Standards Code. The Labour Standards Code specifically excludes unionized workers from exercising the right to refuse. And, Mr. Speaker, the code also excludes employees of 30 different categories of retail business. So my question to the minister is this: why is he telling retail workers that they have a right to refuse when many of them clearly do not?
There were two bills introduced to the House regarding so long as we understand that we have to ask general questions when there are bills before the House, I will ask the